The emergency room fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Dorothy Mae Jenkins's trembling hand as she slowly peeled away the makeshift bandage, her granddaughter Amanda frozen, mid-breath beside the hospital bed. What emerged from beneath the blood-stained cloth wasn't the simple cut Amanda had expected to find. It was something that had been growing, festering, consuming Dorothy's palm for 11 months in absolute silence. Amanda's coffee cup shattered against the linoleum floor, the crash echoing through the sterile hallway as nurses turned their heads. Dr. Chen stepped back involuntarily, his professional composure cracking for just a moment as he processed what lay before him. Dorothy's weathered fingers closed protectively around the mass, her eyes filling with decades of unspoken sacrifice. "I couldn't burden you with this, honey," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night she'd endured alone. "Get Dr. Williams now, Doctor." Chen commanded, his calm voice betraying the urgency coursing through his veins. How long had she been suffering? And what else had Dorothy been hiding? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dorothy Mae Jenkins had stood at her kitchen window, watching the autumn leaves drift past her small Cleveland apartment, unaware that her world was about to change forever. At 72, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had spent 4 decades healing others at St. Mary's Hospital, her silver hair always perfectly pinned, her weathered hands steady despite the arthritis that had begun to settle in her joints. The apartment felt too quiet since Robert's passing 3 years ago. His favorite recliner still sat in the corner, a faded quilt draped over the armrest where he used to rest his head during those final months of battling cancer. Dorothy had learned to fill the silence with routine: morning prayers, afternoon tea, evening phone calls with Amanda when her granddaughter wasn't buried in graduate school assignments or working late shifts to pay for her education. "God helps those who help themselves," Dorothy would whisper each morning, repeating the phrase her own mother had instilled in her during the Great Depression. It had carried her through nursing school when money was tight, through Robert's diagnosis when hope seemed distant, and through the lonely months that followed his funeral when the medical bills continued to arrive like unwelcome visitors. Amanda Richardson, 28 and fiercely independent, visited every few weeks when she could manage it between her social work studies and her marriage to Jake, a construction worker whose calloused hands reminded Dorothy of Robert's in his younger days. Amanda had inherited Dorothy's stubborn streak and compassionate heart, though she carried a guilt that Dorothy recognized, the weight of being too busy, too overwhelmed, too caught up in building her own life to notice when someone needed help. The neighborhood around Dorothy's apartment complex had changed over the years. Young families moved in and out, elderly neighbors passed away or relocated to assisted living facilities, and Dorothy found herself increasingly isolated despite her friendly waves to Mrs. Ethel Patterson next door. The 80-year-old widow had become Dorothy's closest confidant, their friendship built on shared recipes, medical complaints, and the comfortable silence of 2 women who understood loss. Dorothy's modest pension from the hospital barely covered her expenses, but she had always managed. She clipped coupons, shopped sales, and found creative ways to stretch every dollar, skills learned from a generation that knew how to survive hardship. What Amanda didn't know was that Dorothy had been supplementing her granddaughter's education costs for months, quietly sending small amounts whenever she could spare them, telling herself it was an investment in Amanda's future. The small apartment held 40 years of memories. Robert's fishing trophies on the mantel, faded photographs of their simple wedding, Dorothy's nursing school diploma still hanging proudly on the bedroom wall. Her medicine cabinet contained the usual collection of prescriptions that came with age, but Dorothy had always been her own best advocate when it came to health concerns, drawing on decades of medical knowledge to assess what was serious and what could wait. This confidence in her own judgment would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. The first Tuesday of October arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the thin walls of Dorothy's apartment. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, her palm throbbing with a dull ache that had become her constant companion over the past few weeks. Standing at her bathroom mirror, she carefully unwrapped the gauze bandage she had fashioned from old nursing supplies, examining the small mass that had appeared seemingly overnight but had been growing steadily ever since. "Just a cyst," she told her reflection, though her professional eye recognized something more concerning. The discoloration troubled her, along with the way it had hardened and begun to protrude from her palm like an unwelcome visitor that refused to leave. She rewrapped it carefully, pulling on the thin cotton gloves she had taken to wearing constantly, telling herself it was simply the weather turning cold. By 10 o'clock, Amanda was knocking at her door, arms full of grocery bags and wearing the determined expression that meant she intended to spend the afternoon fussing over her grandmother. Dorothy's heart swelled with love and guilt in equal measure as she watched her granddaughter navigate the small kitchen, unpacking fresh vegetables and the expensive organic foods that Dorothy would never buy for herself. "Grandma, you don't have to help," Amanda said, noticing Dorothy's awkward movements as she attempted to wash dishes while keeping her gloved hands dry. "Just sit down and let me take care of this for once." But Dorothy had never been one to sit idle while others worked. She continued scrubbing the breakfast dishes, the warm soapy water gradually soaking through her gloves despite her careful movements. The cotton fabric clung to her skin, and she felt the familiar sharp pain as the mass pressed against the dish's edge. "These old hands aren't what they used to be," Dorothy laughed, trying to mask her discomfort as she lifted a coffee mug. But the wet glove made her grip unsteady, and the ceramic slipped from her fingers, shattering against the sink's porcelain bottom. Amanda spun around at the sound, her face immediately creased with concern. "Grandma, are you hurt?" She reached for Dorothy's hands before the older woman could protest, her fingers finding the tear in the soaked glove where a sharp piece of ceramic had caught the fabric. "It's nothing, dear," Dorothy said, trying to pull her hand away. But Amanda's grip was firm and gentle, her social work training having taught her to notice what others tried to hide. "Let me see," Amanda insisted, and despite Dorothy's protests, she began to carefully peel away the damaged glove. What she revealed made her breath catch in her throat. The mass in Dorothy's palm was roughly the size of a walnut, purple-black in color with an irregular surface that looked angry and inflamed. The skin around it was stretched tight and discolored, and Amanda could see where Dorothy had been attempting to treat it with antiseptic and makeshift bandages. "Dear God, Grandma," Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible. "How long has this been like this?" Dorothy's instinct was to minimize, to protect, to deflect the worry she saw creeping into her granddaughter's eyes. "It's just a little growth, honey. You know how these things happen when you get to be my age. Your grandfather had all sorts of spots and bumps in his later years." But Amanda wasn't buying the casual dismissal. Her social work experience had taught her to recognize the signs when someone was suffering in silence, and the careful way Dorothy had been moving, the constant gloves, the subtle changes in her behavior over the past few months suddenly made terrible sense. "This isn't a spot, Grandma. This is serious. When did it start? Have you seen a doctor?" The questions tumbled out as Amanda gently cradled Dorothy's hand, her mind racing through possibilities. None of them good. Dorothy's carefully constructed facade began to crumble under her granddaughter's persistent concern. She had carried this burden alone for so long, convincing herself that she was protecting Amanda from unnecessary worry, that she could handle whatever this was with the same stoic determination that had carried her through Robert's illness and death. "It's been a few weeks," she lied, the untruth sitting heavy in her chest. In reality, she had first noticed the small, hard bump nearly 11 months ago, right after Amanda had started her final year of graduate school. She had watched it grow slowly, methodically, telling herself each day that it would resolve on its own, that her body would heal itself as it always had. Amanda's eyes filled with tears as she processed the implications of what she was seeing. "Grandma, we need to get you to a doctor right now. This can't wait." The argument that followed would change both their lives forever. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with its usual Tuesday afternoon chaos, but for Dorothy, walking through those familiar doors felt like stepping back in time. She had spent countless hours in these hallways, comforting families, assisting doctors, and witnessing both miracles and tragedies. Now she was the patient, clutching Amanda's arm as they approached the registration desk, her gloved hand throbbing with each heartbeat. "I still think we're overreacting," Dorothy whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. The 20-minute car ride had been filled with Amanda's gentle but persistent questioning, each inquiry chipping away at the wall of secrecy Dorothy had built around her condition. Dr. Marcus Chen arrived within minutes of their registration, his reputation as one of the hospital's most skilled physicians preceding him. Dorothy recognized him immediately. She had assisted in his training rotations 15 years earlier when he was a young resident with nervous hands and endless questions. Now he approached with the confident stride of experience, though his eyes softened when he recognized his former mentor. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said warmly, "it's been too long, though I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." His professional demeanor shifted slightly as he noticed her guarded posture and Amanda's red-rimmed eyes. "Let's take a look at what's troubling you." In the privacy of examination room 3, Dorothy slowly removed her gloves with the reluctance of someone revealing their deepest shame. Dr. Chen's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible intake of breath. His hands, now steady with years of practice, gently examined the mass while Dorothy stared at the ceiling tiles she had once helped install during a hospital renovation. "Now, Dorothy," Dr. Suchen said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of difficult news, "this appears to be quite advanced. Can you tell me when you first noticed it?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Dorothy felt Amanda's eyes on her, felt the expectation of honesty, and for a moment considered maintaining her lie about a few weeks. But something in Dr. Chen's expression told her that deception was no longer possible. 11 months, she admitted, the words barely audible. Maybe closer to a year. Amanda's sharp intake of breath was audible across the small room. "A year? Grandma, how could you hide this for a year?" The floodgates opened then, and Dorothy's carefully maintained composure crumbled. Through tears that she had held back for months, she told them about waking up each morning hoping it had disappeared overnight, about treating it with over-the-counter antiseptics and hoping her nursing knowledge would be enough, about the growing fear that battled with her stubborn pride. "I couldn't burden you, Amanda," Dorothy said, her voice breaking. "You're trying to finish school, build your marriage, start your career. I raised you to be strong and independent, not to worry about your old grandmother's problems." But there was more, and Dr. Chen's gentle probing revealed the deeper truth. Dorothy's insurance situation was precarious. Robert's extended illness had depleted their savings, and her Medicare coverage had gaps that made comprehensive care a luxury she couldn't afford. She had been rationing her medication, skipping routine appointments, and gambling with her health because the alternative seemed impossible. "I've seen patients ignore symptoms before, doctor," Chen said gently, "but never someone with your medical background. You know better than anyone what this could be." Dorothy nodded, fresh tears flowing. "That's what made it worse. Every day I delayed, I knew I was making it harder to treat. But every day I also told myself that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't what I thought it was." Amanda reached for her grandmother's uninjured hand, her own fears temporarily set aside as she processed the magnitude of Dorothy's sacrifice. "The money you sent me for textbooks last semester," she said slowly. "You couldn't afford that, could you?" Dorothy's silence was answer enough. The guilt that had been Amanda's constant companion intensified tenfold as she realized her grandmother had been literally sacrificing her health to support Amanda's education. Dr. Chen interrupted their emotional exchange with the gentle authority of a physician who had delivered difficult news countless times. "We need to run several tests immediately. Blood work, imaging, possibly a biopsy. I won't lie to you. Given the size and appearance, we're looking at something serious." "How serious?" Amanda asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Let's get the tests done first," Dr. Chen replied diplomatically. "But Dorothy, I need you to understand that waiting any longer isn't an option. Whatever financial concerns you have, we'll figure out solutions. Right now, getting you proper treatment is the only priority." As they wheeled Dorothy away for the first round of tests, Amanda sat alone in the waiting room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting of the hospital where her grandmother had dedicated 4 decades of her life to healing others. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had spent her career caring for the sick had been unable to care for herself, trapped by pride, poverty, and the crushing weight of not wanting to be a burden. "The tests would take hours, Doctor." Chen had warned them. Hours of waiting, wondering, and confronting the reality that Dorothy's condition was far more serious than either of them had initially feared. The next 7 days stretched into an eternity of waiting rooms, medical appointments, and sleepless nights. Dorothy found herself back in the familiar yet strange position of being a patient in the hospital where she had once been an authority figure. Nurses who had been her colleagues now spoke to her with the gentle, measured tones reserved for worried family members, and she hated every minute of the role reversal. Amanda had taken a leave of absence from her graduate program despite Dorothy's vehement protests. "Your education comes first," Dorothy insisted repeatedly, but Amanda refused to budge. "My family comes first," she replied each time, echoing the same stubborn determination that had defined Dorothy's own choices for decades. The biopsy procedure had been scheduled for Thursday morning, and Dorothy endured it with the stoic grace that had carried her through countless medical procedures as a nurse. But watching from the family waiting area was torture for Amanda, who paced the linoleum floors and struggled to concentrate on the textbooks she'd brought to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Jake arrived during the afternoon visiting hours, his work boots still dusty from the construction site, and his face creased with concern. He had never been particularly close to Dorothy, viewing her with the respectful distance that many son-in-laws maintain with their spouse's family. But seeing Amanda's distress had stirred something protective in him, and he awkwardly patted Dorothy's shoulder as she lay in the hospital bed. "Amanda tells me you've been keeping secrets," he said with a gentle smile that took the sting out of his words. "Guess stubbornness runs in the family." Dorothy managed a weak laugh. "I suppose I deserve that. I just never wanted to be the kind of person who becomes everyone else's problem." "Family isn't a problem to solve, Dorothy. It's just family." The waiting was made more bearable by an unexpected parade of visitors. Mrs. Ethel Patterson arrived on Wednesday afternoon with a casserole and enough gossip to fill an hour. Former colleagues from the hospital stopped by during shift changes, bringing flowers and sharing memories of Dorothy's legendary competence during medical emergencies. But the most surprising visitors were former patients. People Dorothy had cared for during their most vulnerable moments, who had somehow learned of her hospitalization and wanted to return the kindness she had shown them. Maria Santos, now a mother of 3, had been a teenage girl when Dorothy cared for her during a complicated pregnancy 15 years earlier. "You held my hand during the worst night of my life," she told Dorothy, tears streaming down her face. You told me everything would be okay, and it was. Now I'm telling you the same thing." These visits revealed a pattern that Amanda was only beginning to understand. Dorothy hadn't just been a competent nurse. She had been a lifeline for patients who couldn't afford private care, who needed someone to advocate for them in a complex medical system, who required not just clinical expertise but genuine compassion. The stories emerged gradually. Dorothy staying late to comfort a frightened child, using her own money to buy medication for patients who couldn't afford it, writing letters to insurance companies to appeal denied claims. "She never told us about any of this," Amanda confided to Jake during one of their late-night conversations in the hospital cafeteria. "All these years I thought she was just a regular nurse doing her job, but she was saving people." The financial reality of Dorothy's situation became clearer as the week progressed. Her insurance would cover basic diagnostic procedures, but the treatment options Dr. Chen was discussing required specialist consultations and potentially experimental therapies that fell into coverage gray areas. The hospital's financial counselor, a kind woman named Patricia Wong, met with them on Friday to discuss payment plans and assistance programs. "Your grandmother qualifies for several aid programs," Patricia explained, spreading pamphlets across the small conference table. "But even with maximum assistance, you're looking at significant out-of-pocket expenses." Amanda felt the familiar weight of financial stress settling on her shoulders. She and Jake were barely managing their own bills, and her student loans already consumed a substantial portion of their monthly income. The thought of taking on additional debt was terrifying, but the alternative was unthinkable. During the long hours of waiting, Dorothy found herself reflecting on choices she had made throughout her life. She remembered the Depression-era lessons her mother had taught her about self-reliance and sacrifice, about never taking charity, and always earning your way. These principles had served her well through decades of hard work and modest living, but now they felt like a trap that was preventing her from accepting the help she desperately needed. The memories came in waves during the quiet hospital nights. She remembered Robert's diagnosis, the way his face had crumpled when the doctor delivered the news, and her immediate transformation into his primary caregiver and medical advocate. She had researched treatments, organized medications, and fought with insurance companies while maintaining her full-time nursing schedule. When Robert's treatments required expensive supplements not covered by insurance, she had quietly sold her mother's jewelry without telling him. When his pain medications weren't adequately controlling his symptoms, she had used her nursing connections to find physicians willing to provide samples. The parallels to her current situation were obvious, but Dorothy found it nearly impossible to accept herself as worthy of the same fierce advocacy she had provided for Robert and countless patients. The idea of Amanda sacrificing her education or Jake working extra hours to pay for her medical care felt like a betrayal of everything she had tried to teach them about independence and self-sufficiency. On Saturday evening, Mrs. Patterson arrived with a small army of neighborhood women, each carrying covered dishes and wearing expressions of determined concern. Dorothy recognized the mobilization of a community support network, something she had witnessed and participated in countless times when neighbors faced illness or hardship. But being the recipient of such organized compassion felt foreign and uncomfortable. "We've been talking," Mrs. Patterson announced without preamble, "and we think you're being foolish about accepting help. Helen Morrison down the street reminded us about when your Robert was sick, how you organized meal trains and transportation schedules for everyone who visited. Said you never let anyone face trouble alone, and we're not about to let you start now." The women had stories of their own, times when Dorothy had quietly stepped in during family crises, providing practical help and emotional support without fanfare or expectation of repayment. Agnes Muller remembered Dorothy staying with her mother during her final illness, taking vacation days to provide overnight care when professional help wasn't affordable. Betty Richardson recalled Dorothy's assistance when her grandson was hospitalized with pneumonia, how she had navigated the medical system and advocated for appropriate care. These revelations were as surprising to Amanda as they were humbling to Dorothy. The woman she had always seen as simply a dedicated nurse and loving grandmother had apparently been the informal guardian angel of their entire neighborhood for decades. The realization brought guilt and admiration in equal measure. Guilt for not recognizing the scope of Dorothy's generosity, and admiration for the quiet way she had lived her values without seeking recognition. Dr. Chen visited on Sunday morning with preliminary test results. The news was mixed. The mass was not the aggressive cancer they had initially feared, but it was a rare form of soft tissue growth that required specialized treatment. The condition was treatable but complex, requiring surgery followed by several months of specialized care to prevent recurrence. The good news, Dr. Chen explained, is that with proper treatment, the prognosis is excellent. The challenging news is that this particular condition requires expertise that we don't have here at St. Mary's. You'll need to be referred to the Cleveland Clinic for the surgical procedure, and the follow-up care involves treatments that are still considered experimental by some insurance companies. The cost estimates were staggering. Even with insurance coverage and available assistance programs, the family would be responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in medical expenses. Amanda felt the room spinning as she processed the numbers, mentally calculating their monthly budget and finding no possible way to absorb such costs without declaring bankruptcy. Dorothy's reaction was immediate and definitive. "Then we don't do it," she announced calmly. "I've lived a good life for 72 years. I'm not going to bankrupt my family for the possibility of a few more." The argument that erupted in the hospital room was years in the making, touching on pride, sacrifice, love, and the fundamental question of what family members owe each other during times of crisis. The tension in hospital room 314 was suffocating as Amanda stared at her grandmother in disbelief. Dorothy's calm declaration that she would simply refuse treatment hung in the air like a death sentence, and Amanda felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a combination of rage, desperation, and heartbreak that threatened to consume her entirely. "You can't be serious," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "You're going to give up? After hiding this for almost a year, after putting us through this nightmare of discovery, you're just going to quit?" Dorothy's jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had defined her entire life. "I'm being practical, honey. Some things are more important than extending an old woman's life by a few years. Your future, your marriage, your education, those matter more than whatever time I have left. Don't you dare make this about me!" Amanda's voice rose, drawing concerned glances from nurses passing in the hallway. "Don't you dare use my life as an excuse to give up on yours." Jake stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder, but Amanda shrugged him off. The fury building inside her was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a primal scream against the unfairness of watching someone she loved choose death over financial burden. Dr. Chen cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should give you some privacy to discuss this as a family. But I want to emphasize that this condition, while serious, is very treatable. Mrs. Jenkins, you could have many good years ahead of you with proper care." "Years that would cost my granddaughter her future," Dorothy replied firmly. "I won't allow it." After Dr. Chen left, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment and the distant sounds of hospital life continuing around them. Amanda stared out the window at the autumn sky, trying to process the impossible situation they found themselves in. Her grandmother, the strongest person she had ever known, was choosing death over debt, and Amanda felt powerless to change her mind. "Tell me about the money," Amanda said suddenly, turning back to face Dorothy. Tell me about selling the house. Tell me about the real reason you've been living in that tiny apartment and wearing the same 3 outfits for the past 2 years. Dorothy's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. She had hoped these revelations would never be necessary, that she could take her financial sacrifices to the grave without burdening Amanda with guilt. But the direct question demanded honesty, and Dorothy found herself unable to maintain the protective lies any longer. Your education was more important, Dorothy said quietly. When you got accepted into graduate school, I knew the costs would be overwhelming. Your parents left you nothing when they died in that accident, and Jake's construction work, while honest, doesn't pay enough for both your daily expenses and tuition. So I made a choice. The full scope of Dorothy's sacrifice emerged slowly, painfully, like removing layers of bandages from an infected wound. The house that had been Dorothy and Robert's home for 30 years, where Amanda had spent countless childhood weekends, where family holidays had been celebrated and memories made, sold to a real estate investor for significantly less than market value because Dorothy needed the money immediately. I got enough to pay off Robert's remaining medical bills and give you what you needed for school, Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger as she defended her decision. The apartment is perfectly adequate for one person, and I've been happy there. I don't need much at my age. Amanda felt the room spinning as she processed the magnitude of her grandmother's sacrifice. Every check that had arrived to help with textbooks, every unexpected gift that had made the difference between eating ramen noodles and having a proper meal, every small kindness that had eased the financial pressure of graduate school, all of it had come at the cost of Dorothy's security and comfort. The nursing pension, Amanda said, remembering Dr. Chen's questions about Dorothy's income. You told the financial counselor it was smaller than expected. Dorothy's silence confirmed Amanda's growing suspicion. Through careful questioning, the truth emerged. Dorothy had been donating portions of her pension to the hospital's charity care fund, continuing to help other patients even as her own financial situation became precarious. The woman who couldn't afford proper medical care for herself had been subsidizing treatment for strangers who found themselves in similar circumstances. Jake, who had been quietly listening to these revelations, finally spoke up. Dorothy, with all due respect, you're being incredibly selfish right now. Both women turned to stare at him in shock. Jake rarely spoke during family discussions, preferring to let Amanda handle emotional conversations, but something about Dorothy's martyrdom had triggered his own stubborn streak. You think you're being noble by refusing treatment, he continued, his voice calm but firm. But what you're really doing is making a unilateral decision that affects all of us. You're deciding that Amanda should live with the guilt of watching you die when treatment was available. You're deciding that I should watch my wife blame herself for the rest of her life. You're deciding that your community should lose someone who has spent 70 years making other people's lives better. The words hit Dorothy like physical blows. She had been so focused on protecting Amanda from financial hardship that she hadn't considered the emotional cost of her decision. The thought of Amanda carrying guilt and regret for years to come was almost unbearable, but the alternative seemed equally impossible. I can't destroy your future for the sake of my past, Dorothy whispered, tears flowing freely now. I'm an old woman who has lived her life. You're young people with everything ahead of you. Amanda knelt beside her grandmother's hospital bed, taking the older woman's weathered hands in her own. Grandma, you raised me to believe that family takes care of family. You taught me that love means sacrifice, that we do whatever it takes to protect the people we care about. But somehow you think those rules don't apply when you're the one who needs help. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mrs. Patterson entered, followed by a small group of Dorothy's former colleagues and several people Amanda didn't recognize. The elderly neighbor carried a manila envelope and wore an expression of determined satisfaction. "Dorothy Mae Jenkins," Mrs. Patterson announced, "you are about to learn that pride is a luxury you can no longer afford." What followed was a revelation that would change everything. The impromptu gathering represented just the beginning of something much larger, a grassroots effort that had been building throughout the week as word of Dorothy's situation spread through the networks of people whose lives she had touched over the decades. Betty Williams, Dorothy's former nursing supervisor, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Do you remember Sarah Martinez, the young mother who couldn't afford her insulin? You used your employee discount to buy her medications for 6 months until she found a job with better insurance." Another voice spoke up from the back of the group. "What about the Patterson family when their son needed surgery? You organized a fundraiser and personally matched every donation." The stories poured out, each one revealing another act of quiet generosity that Dorothy had assumed was forgotten. Maria Santos, the former teenage mother, had driven 3 hours from Columbus when she heard about Dorothy's situation. Tom Bradley, a former patient who had become a successful businessman, had taken a day off work to be present for this moment. "You saved my life," he said simply, "not just medically, but in every way that matters. Now it's our turn to save yours, Mrs." Patterson opened the manila envelope with shaking hands. Inside were checks, cash donations, and pledges totaling more than enough to cover Dorothy's treatment costs. The fund had grown throughout the week, driven by social media posts, word-of-mouth campaigns, and the quiet networking of people who remembered Dorothy's kindness during their own times of need. Dorothy stared at the evidence of her community's love and gratitude, overwhelmed by the realization that her decades of giving had created a network of people eager to give back. The financial obstacle that had seemed insurmountable was suddenly removed, leaving only her pride as a barrier to treatment. But even as hope began to emerge, Dorothy's ingrained resistance to accepting help threatened to sabotage this miraculous opportunity. Dorothy stared at the envelope in Mrs. Patterson's hands as if it contained something dangerous rather than life-saving. The room had filled with people whose faces told stories of gratitude and determination, but instead of feeling overwhelmed with joy, Dorothy felt a crushing weight of obligation settling on her chest. The very kindness that was meant to save her life felt like another burden she couldn't bear to accept. "I can't take this," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of conversations around her hospital bed. "I appreciate what you've all done, but I can't be responsible for taking money from people who have their own families to worry about." The rejection hit the room like a physical blow. Amanda watched in horror as her grandmother's stubborn pride threatened to destroy the miracle that had just been laid before them. The faces of Dorothy's supporters showed confusion, hurt, and disbelief that someone would refuse the very help they had sacrificed to provide. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his successful businessman's composure cracking slightly. "Mrs. Jenkins, when I was 19 years old, I was dying in this very hospital. Pneumonia that had turned into sepsis, and my family couldn't afford the experimental treatment that might save my life. Do you remember what you told me?" Dorothy's eyes filled with fresh tears as the memory surfaced. She had worked extra shifts for 2 weeks to help cover the cost difference, using her employee benefits and personal connections to secure the medication Tom needed. "You told me that accepting help wasn't weakness," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. "You said that sometimes letting people give to us is the greatest gift we can offer them. You said that God works through the hands of people who care, and that refusing help was like refusing a blessing." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Dorothy, who had spent decades convincing reluctant patients to accept charity care and community support, was now on the receiving end of her own philosophy and finding it impossible to swallow. But the crisis was deeper than simple pride. That evening, after the well-meaning visitors had departed, and Amanda had gone home to shower and change clothes, Dorothy lay alone in the darkness of her hospital room, wrestling with demons that went far beyond financial concerns. The mass in her palm throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of the choice she was being forced to make. At 3 in the morning, she called for the night nurse and asked for something to help her sleep. But sleep wouldn't come, and by dawn, Dorothy had made a decision that would shatter her family's newfound hope. When Amanda arrived for morning visiting hours, she found her grandmother sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, fully dressed in her own clothes, with her few personal belongings packed in a small bag. "I'm going home," Dorothy announced before Amanda could speak. "I've signed myself out against medical advice, and I've made my decision about the treatment." Amanda felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Grandma, no! You can't do this. We have the money now. The community raised enough to cover everything. And what happens in 5 years when this comes back?" Dorothy's voice was steady but hollow. "What happens when I need more surgery, more treatments, more medications? Do I go back to these same people with my hand out again? Do I become the neighborhood charity case for the rest of my life?" The argument that followed was unlike anything Amanda had ever experienced with her grandmother. Years of pent-up frustration, fear, and love exploded between them in the sterile hospital room, each woman fighting for what she believed was right, while simultaneously breaking the other's heart. "You're not going to be a charity case," Amanda sobbed, grabbing her grandmother's hands. "You're going to be a survivor. You're going to be alive to see me graduate, to meet my children, to continue helping people the way you always have." But Dorothy's mind was made up with the same inflexible determination that had carried her through 7 decades of hardship. "I will not spend whatever time I have left feeling indebted to people who can barely afford to help themselves. I will not become a burden that follows your family for the rest of your lives." Jake arrived to find Amanda crying uncontrollably in the hospital corridor, having been asked to leave the room after their argument became too intense. Dorothy had barricaded herself inside, refusing to see anyone and demanding that the hospital process her discharge immediately. "She's going to kill herself rather than accept help," Amanda said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "I don't know how to reach her. I don't know how to make her understand that we want to help because we love her, not because we pity her." The next several hours became a desperate intervention involving Dr. Chen, the hospital social worker, Mrs. Patterson, and anyone else who might have influence with Dorothy. But she remained unmoved, sitting in her hospital room like a fortress under siege, politely but firmly refusing to engage with anyone who tried to change her mind. It was Tom Bradley who finally broke through her defenses, not with arguments about gratitude or obligation, but with a story that Dorothy had never heard before. He arrived that evening, alone, and asked for just 5 minutes of her time. "The experimental treatment that saved my life when I was 19, he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her bed. "It wasn't covered by insurance, and my family couldn't afford it. But somehow, mysteriously, the bill was paid. The hospital told us an anonymous donor had covered the costs." Dorothy's hands stilled in her lap, a terrible suspicion beginning to form. "It took me 15 years to figure out who that donor was," Tom continued. 15 years of investigating, asking questions, checking hospital records. Do you know what I discovered?" The room was silent, except for the distant sounds of hospital life continuing around them. "I discovered that St. Mary's Hospital had an unofficial fund for patients who couldn't afford critical care, a fund that was maintained entirely by voluntary payroll deductions from employees. And do you know who had been contributing the largest amount from her modest nurse's salary for over 20 years? Dorothy closed her eyes, but Tom wasn't finished. "You saved my life with money you couldn't afford to give, just like these people are trying to save yours now. The difference is that you've been hiding your generosity for decades, while they're proud to help you openly. You taught me that accepting help was a gift to the giver. Now I'm asking you to give that gift to the people who love you." The truth of her own hypocrisy hit Dorothy like a physical blow. She had spent years convincing patients and families to accept charity care, arguing that community support was a blessing rather than a burden. She had personally sacrificed her own financial security to help strangers, never questioning whether they were worthy of assistance or whether they might become dependent on charity. But when that same compassion was offered to her, every principle she had preached to others suddenly felt impossible to accept for herself. The breakdown that followed was years in the making. Dorothy collapsed under the weight of her own contradictions, sobbing with the raw grief of someone who had carried impossible burdens for too long. The walls she had built around her pride and self-reliance crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since Robert's death. Amanda held her grandmother as she cried, both women finally understanding that this crisis was about much more than money or medical treatment. It was about a woman who had defined herself entirely through giving to others, who had no identity beyond her role as caregiver and helper, who literally didn't know how to exist as someone who needed rather than provided care. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but in that moment of complete vulnerability, something fundamental shifted in Dorothy's heart. For the first time in her adult life, she began to consider the possibility that her worth as a human being wasn't dependent on her ability to be self-sufficient. The revelation that Dorothy had been the anonymous benefactor behind countless medical miracles at St. Mary's Hospital sent shockwaves through everyone who thought they knew her story. But what emerged over the following days would prove that even this generous legacy was just the surface of a much deeper truth that had been hidden for decades. Amanda sat in the hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, when Dr. Chen approached with a manila folder and an expression that suggested he was carrying news that would change everything. The cafeteria was nearly empty, lit only by the harsh fluorescent lights that never dimmed, creating an otherworldly atmosphere perfect for the conversation that was about to unfold. "I've been reviewing your grandmother's employment records," Dr. Chen said quietly, settling into the plastic chair across from Amanda. "There are some things about Dorothy's financial situation that don't add up, and I think you need to know the full truth before she makes any final decisions about treatment." What Dr. Chen revealed would have been impossible to believe if not for the documented evidence spread across the small cafeteria table. Dorothy's personnel file contained decades of payroll records, insurance claims, and financial documents that painted a picture of systematic self-sacrifice that went far beyond anything Amanda had imagined. The anonymous fund that had saved Tom Bradley's life was indeed maintained by employee contributions, but Dorothy's donations hadn't come from her regular salary. For over 20 years, she had been working double shifts, taking on extra responsibilities, and accepting hazard pay assignments specifically to generate additional income that she immediately donated to patient care funds. The woman who claimed she couldn't afford her own medical treatment had been secretly funding medical care for others for most of her adult life. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said, pointing to a series of entries from 15 years earlier. "Your grandmother worked the night shift in our infectious disease ward during the SARS outbreak, when other nurses were refusing those assignments due to safety concerns. The hazard pay for those shifts was substantial, and every penny went to the Patient Assistance Fund." But the financial records revealed an even more shocking pattern. Dorothy hadn't just been donating her extra earnings. She had been systematically depleting her retirement savings to maintain her charitable giving even after Robert's illness had destroyed their financial security. The sale of their house hadn't been a one-time sacrifice to fund Amanda's education. It had been the final act in a decades-long process of giving away everything she owned to help others. She's been living in poverty for years, Amanda whispered, staring at the documents that detailed her grandmother's true financial situation. While I was accepting money for school, while I was complaining about student loans and textbook costs, she was literally giving away her future to help strangers. The scope of Dorothy's deception was breathtaking in its complexity. She had maintained the appearance of modest but comfortable retirement while actually surviving on the absolute minimum necessary for basic needs. The apartment Amanda thought was adequate was actually subsidized housing for low-income seniors. The simple meals Dorothy prepared during visits weren't a choice but a necessity born from a food budget that allowed no room for extras. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Dr. Chen hesitated before opening the final section of Dorothy's file, his expression suggesting that what he was about to share would be the most difficult truth of all. Amanda, there's something else. Your grandmother's insurance situation isn't what she's been telling us. She does qualify for the treatment, but she's been actively sabotaging her own coverage for years. The explanation that followed revealed a level of self-sacrifice that bordered on self-destruction. Dorothy had been systematically downgrading her insurance coverage, accepting higher deductibles and reduced benefits in order to lower her monthly premiums. The money she saved on insurance costs had been donated to help other patients afford their medications and treatments. She could have maintained comprehensive coverage, Dr. Chen explained, but she chose to make herself vulnerable in order to help others who had no choice about their vulnerability. The woman who can't afford her own cancer treatment has been paying for other people's cancer treatments for decades. Amanda felt the room spinning as she processed the magnitude of her grandmother's hidden sacrifice. Every act of kindness that had seemed spontaneous and generous had actually been the result of calculated self-deprivation. Dorothy hadn't just been giving away her extra money. She had been giving away her security, her comfort, and ultimately her health to fund medical care for people she barely knew. The next morning brought another revelation that would shatter everything Amanda thought she understood about her family's history. Mrs. Patterson arrived at the hospital with a shoebox full of letters and documents that Dorothy had asked her to keep safe in case something happened. The elderly neighbor's hands shook as she explained why she had decided to break her promise of confidentiality. "Your grandmother made me swear never to tell anyone about these," Mrs. Patterson said, "but I can't watch her die to protect secrets that might save her life." The letters told a story that spanned decades and revealed the true motivation behind Dorothy's pathological generosity. Hidden among the thank you notes from grateful patients and families were letters from a daughter Amanda had never known existed. A daughter who had been given up for adoption when Dorothy was 17 years old, long before she met Robert or built the life Amanda knew. The correspondence revealed a relationship that had been maintained in secret for over 50 years. Dorothy's biological daughter, Linda, had found her birth mother in the 1980s, and they had developed a careful friendship that was kept hidden to protect everyone involved. Linda had struggled with addiction, mental illness, and financial instability throughout her adult life, and Dorothy had been quietly supporting her and her children for decades. "She never wanted you to know," Mrs. Patterson explained through tears, "because she was afraid you'd think she loved Linda more than she loved you." But every extra shift she worked, every donation she made to patient care funds, it was all connected to her guilt about giving up her first child. The letters painted a heartbreaking picture of a woman trying to balance her love for the granddaughter she was raising with her guilt over the daughter she had abandoned. Dorothy's charitable giving hadn't been random acts of kindness. They had been a form of penance, a way of atoning for what she saw as the greatest failure of her life. Amanda read through decades of correspondence with growing horror and admiration. Linda's letters detailed struggles with poverty, addiction, and mental health issues, while Dorothy's responses offered emotional support and increasingly desperate financial assistance. The money that Amanda had assumed was going to hospital charity funds had often been diverted to help Linda's family avoid eviction, pay for rehabilitation programs, or cover medical expenses for Dorothy's secret grandchildren. She was supporting two families, Amanda whispered, understanding finally dawning. All these years she was trying to take care of Linda's children and me at the same time, and she never told either of us about the other. The final letter in the collection was dated just 3 months earlier, and its contents revealed the true reason why Dorothy had been hiding her illness. Linda had written to say that her youngest son needed surgery that wasn't covered by Medicaid, and she was begging Dorothy for help one more time. Dorothy's response, written in her careful handwriting, promised to find the money somehow, even though her own savings were already exhausted. She was planning to refuse treatment, not just to avoid being a burden, Amanda realized with growing horror, but to make sure her life insurance money could help Linda's family. She was literally choosing to die so that she could continue taking care of everyone else even after she was gone. The revelation recontextualized everything about Dorothy's character and motivation. Her refusal to accept community support wasn't just about pride. It was about maintaining her ability to continue supporting the secret family whose existence had driven her choices for decades. The woman who seemed irrationally stubborn about accepting help was actually trapped in a web of obligations and guilt that made her medical treatment feel like a betrayal of promises she had made long before Amanda was born. Dr. Chen listened to these revelations with the expression of someone who had thought he understood human nature but was discovering new depths of complexity and sacrifice. "We need to contact Linda," he said finally. "Dorothy needs to understand that her death won't solve the problems she's been trying to fix, and that the people who love her deserve the chance to help carry these burdens." But finding Linda would prove easier said than done, and the attempt to reunite Dorothy with her estranged daughter would trigger the final crisis that would either save Dorothy's life or destroy the last remaining connections she had to the world. The truth about Dorothy's hidden family would force everyone involved to confront questions about love, loyalty, sacrifice, and what family members owe each other across decades of separation and silence. 6 months after Dorothy's successful surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, the Jenkins family home buzzed with an energy that had been absent for years. The modest 2-bedroom house that Amanda and Jake had purchased using a portion of the community fund, with Dorothy's reluctant but grateful acceptance, had become the center of something beautiful and unexpected. Dorothy sat in her favorite armchair by the living room window, her hand completely healed except for a thin scar that she wore like a badge of courage, watching her great-grandson Michael play with blocks on the carpet before her. Linda Martinez. Dorothy had learned that her daughter had taken her adoptive family's surname, had arrived from Phoenix 3 days after the emergency contact Amanda had made through social services. The reunion between mother and daughter after 5 decades of careful distance had been tentative at first, complicated by layers of guilt, regret, and unspoken expectations. But Linda's presence during Dorothy's recovery had gradually transformed their relationship from one of obligation and secrecy to something approaching genuine family connection. "I can't believe I spent 50 years thinking you regretted having me," Linda said, settling into the chair beside Dorothy while Amanda bustled around the kitchen preparing Sunday dinner. "All those years of careful letters and hidden support, and I never understood that you were trying to love me from a distance because you thought that's what I needed." Dorothy's eyes filled with the gentle tears that came easily now, a stark contrast to the stoic composure she had maintained for most of her life. The surgery had been successful beyond Dr. Chen's most optimistic projections, but the real healing had come from finally allowing herself to be vulnerable, to accept help, and to believe that her worth wasn't measured solely by what she could give to others. "I was 17 and terrified. Dorothy replied, her voice steady but soft. "I thought giving you to parents who could provide for you properly was the most loving thing I could do. I never imagined that loving you from a distance would become such a complicated dance that neither of us fully understood." The kitchen conversation that floated into the living room revealed another layer of the family's transformation. Amanda was on the phone with Tom Bradley, who had become an unofficial coordinator for what was now formally known as the Dorothy Jenkins Compassionate Care Foundation. The fund that had started as an emergency collection to save Dorothy's life had evolved into a permanent endowment that helped hospital patients navigate financial hardships during medical crises. "The foundation approved 12 applications this month," Amanda was saying, her voice bright with pride. "That's families who won't have to choose between medical treatment and financial ruin because of what Grandma started decades ago." Jake entered from the backyard, where he had been grilling hamburgers, his face flushed with heat and satisfaction. The man who had once viewed Dorothy with respectful distance had become one of her fiercest advocates, and his practical nature had proven invaluable in managing the logistics of their expanded household. "Mrs. Patterson called," he announced to the room. "The neighborhood association voted to name the new community garden after Dorothy. They want to hold a dedication ceremony next month." Dorothy shook her head with amused embarrassment. All this fuss over an old woman who finally learned to accept help? "You'd think I had discovered the cure for cancer instead of just agreeing to get my hand fixed." But everyone in the room understood that Dorothy's transformation represented something much more significant than a successful medical treatment. Her journey from stubborn independence to graceful acceptance of community support had inspired changes that rippled far beyond their immediate family. The foundation was receiving inquiries from hospitals across Ohio about implementing similar patient advocacy programs. Social workers were using Dorothy's story as a case study in helping elderly patients overcome pride-based barriers to care. Linda's son Michael, now 4 years old and no longer requiring the expensive surgery that had prompted Dorothy's final financial sacrifice, had brought an energy to the household that reminded everyone why the fight for Dorothy's life had been so important. His laughter filled rooms that had been quiet for too long, and his innocent questions about why Great-Grandma Dorothy had so many visitors helped the adults process their own amazement at the scope of Dorothy's hidden influence. "Mommy," Michael said, looking up from his blocks at Linda, "why do all these people love Great-Grandma Dorothy so much?" Linda exchanged glances with Amanda, both women recognizing the profound simplicity of the question. "How do you explain to a 4-year-old that some people spend their entire lives quietly making the world better for others, often at great personal cost, and that such dedication creates bonds that transcend normal social relationships?" "Because she took care of people when they were scared and hurt," Linda answered carefully. "And when you take care of people like that, they remember it forever." Dr. Chen's monthly follow-up visits had become social occasions rather than strictly medical appointments. During his most recent examination, he had marveled not just at Dorothy's physical recovery, but at the transformation in her overall demeanor. The woman who had been prepared to die rather than accept help was now actively participating in efforts to help others navigate similar challenges. "I've been thinking about retiring from active practice," Dr. Chen had mentioned during his last visit, "and focusing on medical advocacy work. Dorothy, I'd like to talk to you about joining the Foundation's Board of Directors. Your perspective on both sides of the patient experience would be invaluable." The invitation represented a full-circle moment that would have been impossible to imagine during those desperate days in the hospital when Dorothy's survival had seemed uncertain. The woman who had spent decades secretly supporting patient care was being asked to openly lead efforts to improve healthcare accessibility for vulnerable populations. Evening descended on the house with the comfortable rhythm of a family that had learned to appreciate simple moments together. Amanda finished her graduate degree the previous month with Dorothy and Linda both present at the ceremony. The first time in 50 years that Dorothy's two daughters had been in the same place at the same time. The scholarship fund that had been established in Dorothy's name would help other students complete their education without the financial stress that had complicated Amanda's journey. As the family gathered for dinner, Dorothy looked around the table at faces that represented the unexpected gifts that had emerged from her darkest crisis. Linda was planning to relocate permanently to Cleveland, bringing her children closer to the grandmother they were finally able to know openly. Amanda had accepted a position with the County Social Services Department, specializing in helping elderly clients navigate healthcare and financial assistance programs. Jake had started a small contracting business with financial backing from Tom Bradley, who had become something like a son to Dorothy. "I used to think that accepting help was a sign of weakness," Dorothy said as they joined hands for grace before dinner. "I thought that needing other people meant I had failed somehow. But I understand now that letting people love you is actually one of the hardest and most important things you can do." Mrs. Patterson, who had become a regular at Sunday dinners, squeezed Dorothy's hand gently. "Some of us are slow learners when it comes to receiving love," she said with a smile. "But we get there eventually." The prayer that followed was simple and heartfelt, acknowledging not just the food before them, but the journey that had brought them together. Michael's addition of, "and thank you for fixing great-grandma's hand," brought tears and laughter in equal measure. Outside, the autumn evening settled over Cleveland with the same gentle beauty that had marked the beginning of Dorothy's crisis exactly 1 year earlier. But inside the warm house, a family that had been fractured by secrets and pride had been rebuilt on foundations of honesty, acceptance, and the revolutionary understanding that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer the people who love us is allowing them to take care of us in return. The scar on Dorothy's palm had faded to a thin, white line, barely visible unless someone looked closely. But it served as a daily reminder that healing, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, often requires the courage to reveal our vulnerabilities and trust others with our pain. In learning to accept help, Dorothy had not only saved her own life but had taught everyone around her that love expressed through service is meaningless without love expressed through acceptance. Dear friends, Dorothy's journey reminds us that the hardest lesson in life isn't learning how to give, it's learning how to receive. For decades, we've defined ourselves by how much we can do for others, how strong we can be, how little we need. We've worn our independence like armor, believing that asking for help somehow diminishes our worth. But Dorothy discovered what many of us fear to admit, that true strength lies in vulnerability, and the greatest gift we can give our loved ones is allowing them to love us back. Her story isn't just about medical treatment or community support. It's about the revolutionary act of believing we deserve care, even when we can no longer be the caregiver. It's about understanding that our families don't see us as burdens. They see us as treasures worth fighting for. Dorothy's scar became a symbol of courage, not the courage to suffer alone, but the courage to let others share our pain. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can say isn't, "I'm fine," or "I don't need help," but simply, "I'm scared, and I need you." That's not weakness, that's wisdom. What's the hardest thing for you about accepting help from family? Have you ever hidden a problem to protect someone you love? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.